Now I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Today's speaker is Sandra Bennett. She's an instructional designer for online learning and an adjunct instructor for the College of Education Graduate Elementary Studies, K-6 at Wilmington University. Sandy has spent 22 years as an educator and over 10 years as an instructor at Wilmington. She also is a recipient of the 2013 Blackboard Catalyst Award for Exemplary Course, which means her course was chosen by her peers in the Exemplary Course Program Directors as meeting the standards set forth in the Exemplary Course Program rubric. And if any of you are participating in that program this year, the deadline to submit your course or to sign up to be a reviewer is Monday, February 17th. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Sandy, who is going to talk about writing goals and objectives.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you all for having me today. I'm very excited to present, and I hope that you find this webinar to be informational and helpful. So with that, we're going to begin. Today's presentation is going to be about writing goals and objectives and how it's an integral part of an online course. The planning phase of writing goals and objectives is very important in an online course. In an online environment, meaningful and measurable goals and objectives help your students to understand what you expect of them and help them organize their time and efforts so they can meet those expectations. It's also important for you to know your audience, which are your students, and to evaluate the suitability of your materials for your online use. So with that, let's move forward to the next slide and get started with some good information, I hope. Today, by the end of this presentation, you're going to be able to do the following. You'll see that there are 4 objectives written for you that you will hopefully be able to understand and know by the end of this presentation. I thought we would begin with just a brief history of instructional goals or educational goals. And as you can see, they began in World War II. The roots of instructional theory can be traced to early efforts by educational psychologists to develop a connection between the science of psychology and the practical application of learning theory in educational settings. There are 2 people that are linked to this, 2 theorists at the turn of the century, John Dewey and Edward Thorndike. Thorndike developed a body of instructional design principles that included task analysis and teaching methods based on his research findings and student evaluation methods. The contemporary foundations of instructional theory can be rooted both in behaviorism and in the general trend of the 1950s toward applying scientific approaches to the social sciences. We all know this man, Benjamin Bloom. He also influenced curriculum development and writing goals and objectives. I'm sure we've all seen that long, long list of verbs. During the 1950s and 60s, results of a project directed by Bloom touched education at all levels around the world. He and his colleagues developed this taxonomy or classification system of educational objectives. Objectives were divided into 3 domains, which we'll look at later, and a handbook describing the objectives in each area was eventually published. And I think what it's dwindled down to is that list of the helpful 100, if you're familiar with that. So teachers and curriculum designers use these taxonomies to develop instructional objectives and goals for online courses and face-to-face courses as well. Today, of course, a number of educational psychologists have turned their attention from research on learning to research on teaching. Their findings shaped educational policy and practice during those years and since. Much of the research that they focused on was effective teaching that points toward a model of teaching that is related to improved student learning called direct instruction or explicit teaching. So let's take a look at the difference. It's important to know the difference between goals and objectives. And some of you may be asking, well, I already have these on my syllabus. Why do I need to be concerned about this? And the reason is that you still may be starting a syllabus from scratch where you do have to write the objectives, or on your syllabus they may be vague or have verbs that are vague and you need to rewrite them. Or when you're developing a course, you want to develop objectives that lead a module or lead a unit. So goals are long-term aims that you want to accomplish, and objectives are concrete attainments that can be achieved by following a certain number of steps. Goals and objectives are often used interchangeably, but the main difference comes in their level of concreteness. Objectives are very concrete, whereas goals are less structured. And you'll see that they are also called all the others that you see listed in those bullets: competencies, behavioral objectives, terminal objectives, and so forth. Again, looking at the difference, some terms may help you to decipher the difference between the two. An easy way to remember how they differ: goals has the word go in it. Your goals should go forward in a specific direction. However, goals are more about everything you accomplish on your journey rather than getting to that distant point. Goals will often go into undiscovered territory, and you therefore can't even know where the end will be. Objectives has the word object in it. Objects are concrete, and they are something that you can hold in your hand, or it's measurable. Because of this, your objectives can be clearly outlined with timelines and in those measurable terms. And what you want to be asking yourself with objectives is, what do you want your students to learn? And to know that objectives provide this clear roadmap for students in the course. What do you want your students to be able to do with what they are learning? So a picture to help you visualize it all. The goal of a learning activity is like a target. Goals are generically for an achievement or accomplishments for which certain efforts are put. Goals are statements about general aims or purposes of education that are broad, long-ranged, intended outcomes and concepts. Whereas objectives are brief, clear statements that describe the desired learning outcomes of instruction, those specific skills or values and attitudes that students should exhibit that reflect those broader goals. Objectives articulate and describe what students will learn in a course. They also are benchmarks instructors use to determine how well students are learning in the course. So let's take a look. Here's where the poll is going to happen. You'll see 4 statements in front of you. And looking at each of those, and based upon what I just explained to you, hopefully not too quickly, I hope I'm not talking too fast, looking at those 4 statements, can you identify the goals? And before I ask you to show me your poll answer, looking at those, can you identify the goals? And then with your poll, can you tell me what which one of those is the objective? So if you know the objective, go ahead and use your poll and go ahead and show it.
And we'll give everyone about 15, 20 seconds, and then we'll publish those results to the whiteboard. So just a few more seconds if you want to cast your last votes.
Okay, so it looks like we have some answers. None of them. Oh, wow, that's so interesting. Well, the answer is, and I'm going to switch to the next slide. I don't know, Lauren, if you want to move that to the next slide to show the answer. But it looks like most of you chose A as the objective and the rest are goals. So A is the objective. Remember that instructional objectives describe in detail the behaviors that students will be able to perform, something that they'll do, something that is measurable. So in this case, you see that they're going to state the definition of a complementary, in this term, medical intervention of therapy. So instructional objectives describe in detail the behaviors that students will be able to perform at the end of a lesson, at the end of a unit, or just at the end of instruction. And it also shows the conditions and criteria which determine acceptable levels of performance. Let's take a look at some common pitfalls, because it is confusing to know the difference between goals and objectives. Sometimes with writing goals and objectives, we have what's called false performance, where in the case that you see the first two orange statements, they have the appearance of objectives, but they contain no performances. Demonstrate and be able to are actually very vague terms, and they're not objectives. Although it gives you an idea of a student being able to do something, it actually is a false performance. There are also false givens. False givens, as you see with these two statements, these are words or phrases that follow the word given in an objective, but that describe something other than specific conditions the learner must have or show. Most typically, the words describe something about the instruction itself, and they don't describe the instructional procedure in your objective. And then another pitfall are teaching points. And similar to a false given, this statement that you see describes a teaching point, a practice exercise, or some other aspect of classroom activity. And we really don't want to describe what the teacher will do. We want to, in an objective, state what students will be able to do and know by the end of a lesson or by the end of a unit or so forth. We have to be careful with writing objectives because it does have to be written in the terms of the student. So not to confuse you any, but just to reiterate a few things to remember about goals, and then we'll move on to objectives. Instructional goals. Every instructional goal should represent an intended learning outcome. Each instructional goal should begin with a verb that is general enough to cover a domain of student performance. Now, I know that sounds confusing, but look at the last bullet. It's a broad statement of purpose. Each instructional goal should be limited to one general learning outcome. They should be free of specific subject matter or content. Objectives are going to be more specific. I see a question, if it's okay, Lauren, to answer it. Course descriptions are actually not goals. Course descriptions describe what the course is about. Course goals or instructional goals give this, if you want to think about it, broad umbrella, that bigger picture that the students are going to get. The objectives are the steps that they're going to take to get there, if that makes sense. So we'll take a look at objectives a little more specifically. What we want to do with objectives is remember to begin with the end in mind. If you're familiar with backwards design or understanding by design, you'll know that whenever you plan a unit or a lesson, you begin with the end in mind. You want to begin with what you want students to know by the end of your lesson, and then you backward map. Well, what I want to share with you is a way to help you write those objectives, and it's an acronym called Be Smart. SMART is the acronym. And just to give some background about this, a man named Robert Mager argued that learning objectives should be specific, measurable objectives that both guide instructors and aid students in the learning process. And he shared another way to write objectives, which we'll look at in just a moment. But let's look at Be Smart. In this acronym, I'll go to the next slide. In this acronym, you'll see that it stands for specific words. So with Be Smart, the S is for specific, the M is for measurable, the A is for achievable, R is for relevant, and T is for time-bound. And there are some questions you see on the right that will help you to understand what each of those criteria mean. And what I'd like to do for a few moments is to help explain more about each of those letters in Be Smart. Developing specific measurable objectives requires your time, it requires orderly thinking, and it requires a clear picture of the results expected. The more specific your objectives are, the easier it will be for students to demonstrate success. So looking at SMART, let's look at the S first. Specific. What exactly are we going to do for whom? The specific part of an objective tells us what will change for whom in concrete terms. It identifies the population or setting and specific actions that will result. In some cases, it's appropriate to indicate how the change will be implemented through training, through instruction, so forth. Verbs such as coordinate, facilitate, enhance are not good verbs to use in objectives because they're vague. So is understand. And understand is actually a verb that we see a lot on our syllabi. On the other hand, verbs such as provide, train, publish, show, write, read, those are all clear, specific verbs of what will be done. No is not a good verb either, you're right. How can you see know? How can you see that a student knows something? You cannot step into their brains and see that they know or see that they understand. Objectives have to give you a measurable, observable behavior that you are able to see. And in an online course, it's going to have to be something that you see either in writing or that you hear if they are participating in collaborate or something that has voice. Yes, there's actually, I'm going to share with you a website that gives you something called the Helpful 100. It's actually on the next slide or two, that will give you this list of 100 verbs that are great verbs from Bloom's that you can use for objectives. Let's look at the M for measurable. And the question that we want to keep in mind with measurable is it quantifiable? And can we, as instructors, measure it? Measurable implies the ability to count or otherwise quantify an activity or its results. It also means that the source of and mechanism for collecting measurement data are identified. And that collection of these data is feasible. A baseline measurement is required to document change. If the baseline is unknown or will be measured as a first activity step, it should be indicated in the objective as what you're going to, what you're going to measure. That sounded confusing. If a specific measurement instrument is used, you might want to incorporate its use into your objective, if that clarifies. Another important consideration is whether change can be measured in a meaningful and interpretable way. Can the performance of the objective be observed and measured? And if it can't, then it does not meet that criteria. Looking at the A, achievable, the question that leads us here is, can we get it done in the proposed time frame with the resources and support we have available? The objective must be feasible with the available resources that students are given, appropriately limited in scope, and within the programs or courses control and influence. Sometimes specifying an expected level of change can be tricky. In some situations, it's more important to consider percentage of change or the number of people. Will the effort required to create the amount of change be a good use of your resources? With a reasonable amount of effort and application, can the objective be achieved? And you have to ask yourself here, are you attempting too much? An objective should not be wordy. It should be very specific, and it should be to the point of what you want students to learn or be able to do. Looking at the R, relevant, will this objective have an effect on the desired goal? Remember, going back to that goal, that big umbrella. Relevant relates to the relationship between the objective and the overall goal of the course. Is the objective important or worthwhile to the learner, or is it busy work? Is it something that is not important, not relevant? When developing a course into an online course, in my case, just to share my own personal experience, the syllabi that we have honestly 100 objectives on it. And when you're trying to develop a course, I'm thinking to myself, how do I choose which are appropriate for this course specifically and what these students are to learn? So you have to think about, is it relevant? Is it worthwhile? And if it isn't, don't use it, because then you're trying to measure things that you're not even teaching your students. Lastly, let's look at the T, time bound. When will this objective be accomplished? A specified and reasonable time frame should be incorporated into the objective statement. Sometimes you'll see, by the end of this unit, or by the end of this course, or it can even say by a specific date. But is there a time limit, a rate number, a percentage, or frequency clearly stated? And when will the objective be accomplished? Writing SMART objectives also helps you think about and identify elements of the evaluation and measurement that you want in a course. Another way, to write objectives is using the ABCD method, and that's what we're going to look at here. And all of what I've just shared about SMART will be evidenced here in the ABCD approach. The ABCD approach is a method of writing objectives. And again, the ABCD is an acronym. A is for audience, B is for behavior, C is for conditions, and D is for degree of mastery. And this ABCD model is taken here from Penn State University online. So if you want to visit that to give you more information, this is a great website to look at. Let's take a look at each one of these parts of writing the objective. The A is audience. The learners, the readers, the participant. But what I want you to see here is that it's not the instructor. Remember that we're not writing objectives for the instructor. We're writing the objective for our students. At the end of instruction, what will the students be able to do? This is usually written as the learner, the student. However, it could be written as specific as the third grade student or the third grade science student. But I suggest that less is more, the student. Make it simple so that the objective does not get too wordy. The B. The B is the behavior, the verb. And you can see down at the bottom under in the parentheses where it says what the participants will do. That website is the Helpful 100 that have those 100 verbs that are measurable and observable. B is the behavior. It's the verb that describes what the learner will be able to do after the instruction. This is the heart of the objective, and it must be measurable and observable. In addition, these verbs must be specific. Verbs such as know, understand, comprehend, and appreciate are difficult to measure and are therefore not good choices for objectives. While there are many good verbs to choose from for instructional objectives, the Helpful 100 is probably the best place to start. Part of the behaviors for educational objectives or instructional objectives fall into these three categories, and I referenced them back at the beginning. The three domains or categories are cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. We in education typically use the cognitive domain. but I wanted to explain each of those just so that you have an understanding. The cognitive domain involves knowledge and the development of intellectual skills. And this comes directly from Bloom. This is what Bloom said. It includes the recall or recognition of specific facts. It involves the recall or recognition of procedural patterns and concepts that serve in the development of intellectual abilities and skills. And within the cognitive domain are 6 major categories. And those categories are knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. And if you're that visual learner, you can probably see that triangle where we start from the simplest behavior of knowledge to the most complex, evaluation. The categories can be thought of as degrees of difficulty. That is, the first ones must be normally mastered before the next ones can take place. Looking at the affective domain, this includes the manner in which we deal with things emotionally, such as feelings and values, appreciation, enthusiasms, motivations, and attitudes. Sometimes you'll see those in counseling, those types of instruction, or in counseling, the actual counseling that takes place. And then lastly, the last domain is the psychomotor domain. And this includes physical movement, coordination, and the use of the motor skill areas. The development of these skills requires practice and is measured in terms of speed, precision, distance, procedures, or techniques. Often these are hands-on objectives. Riding a bike would be something that is easily observable. Writing the objective to teach someone to ride a bike would be one way to think of that. Moving forward into the next part of the ABCD model is the condition. And the condition, as you can see, is imposed by the instructor. Conditions are the circumstances under which the objectives must be completed. What will the instructor allow the student to use in order to complete the instruction? What equipment or tools can the student have access to, such as a calculator or a map or the book or class notes? Obviously, it would be much more difficult to make calculations without a calculator than with one. So usually what you'll see with the condition part of the ABCD model is those 2 words, when and while. When given a set of 5 unlabeled slides, or while working independently, is what you'll see as part of that, or that part of the objective. Lastly, the D part, the degree. The degree identifies the standard that the learner must meet to reach acceptable performance. In other words, what degree of accuracy does the learner have to achieve in order that his or her performance be judged proficient? The degree of accuracy should be related to real-world expectations. Degree of accuracy can be related as a time limit in 20 minutes, or a number of correct answers, 7 out of 10, or a range of accuracy, 90%, or some type of qualitative standard. So we're asking, what is good enough? What has to happen for the learner to succeed? So this is the D part. And all 4 of these parts are put together to create an objective. So let's take a look at an objective and see how it's broken down into those 4 parts. This image shows a breakdown of an objective, and that objective is using a job aid, the instructor will successfully write a learning objective that is observable, measurable, and clearly defined. So you can see where the A, B, C, D is. The A is the instructor in green. The B is the behavior, which is in red. You see performance, will successfully write a learning objective. The C, the condition, is what is given using a job aid. And then that success criteria is that is observable, measurable, and clearly defined. Remember that it doesn't have to be numerical. You don't have to see the 7 out of 10, 100%. You can see just what's going to be good enough, what's going to be the qualitative standard. So that hopefully will give you a visual of how to break down that objective into those 4 parts. So let's take a look at another one, which is not broken down, or actually is broken down in a different way. So we have a different objective that says, when given a list of 20 words, the learner will be able to identify correctly all the cognitive action verbs. So as you see, the A is the learner. The B, the behavior, is one word, identify. And this is a word from Bloom's taxonomy, those helpful 100. The condition is written in the beginning of the objective when given a list of 20 words. And then the degree is 100%, or all. And you can see that right after the word correctly. So there's another example of. So, like I said in the beginning, how does this help me if I already have a syllabus that has objectives on it? Well, it's an added benefit for you to understand whether or not they are written correctly. And it also helps you when you're placing those objectives into your online course, or you're writing your own objectives for a unit or a lesson within or in your online course. There's also an added benefit to a clearly stated learning objective, and it serves 2 functions. Clearly stated learning objectives help the student focus on what is expected in terms of both preparing for individual class sessions and preparing for assignments and tests and so forth. They help the instructor stay on topic and avoid wandering down the garden path to watch the butterflies while harvesting peas. Silly, but it shows you that it really does help the instructor to stay focused. By having a clearly stated learning objective, it helps the instructor also reach those planned outcomes. So with that in mind, and everything that I've said, I think I'm right at 11:45. Questions and answers. Before I move, I just want to go one slide and just share with you that there are some references, things that websites that I used that helped me to put together this this webinar presentation, so you should be able to access those and see. Those websites give some great ideas for writing goals and objectives and some good information. One of them is the Be Smart that I shared with you. The other is the ABCD model.